Hi everyone, thank you so much for taking the time out and coming to listen to me. I think I'm particularly excited that my talk in particular is happening right bang in the middle of the fees must fall crisis that's going on at the moment. And I'm hoping that by sharing what I've done together with Daniela in the media department, and in particular in the journalism program, where I teach politics and business reporting as well as editorial management, will help you in terms of how you think and how you frame your curriculum and the kind of questions you should be asking. So when I was hired, I suppose I was one of those lucky people who were hired full time in October. So I had about 3 months in which to think about my curriculum, what I wanted to teach, etc., whilst also pulling together some marks for editorial management, which I was teaching on a part-time basis. So the most fundamental questions for me, and I believe it should be for any teacher, and hopefully when we have the discussion, you also then add your own questions, because I think it's important that we share and discuss the kind of questions that we think about. But for me, the key thing is that I wanted to know is, who am I teaching, right? Why am I teaching them? Whose knowledge am I teaching them? And to what end or purpose am I teaching them? What impact does the purpose have on the manner in which I teach? What do the students bring to the learning process? Who am I as a teacher? What do I bring to the teaching process? Does it help or hinder the learning process? So for me, it was very important to be self-aware as a lecturer before I stand up there and I use my power and I just impart knowledge. It was important to understand, who am I and what baggage am I bringing to the classroom? Who are the students and what baggage do they bring to the classroom? And how do we make our selective baggages work for each other? So as I've just said, it was about bringing a context, a new context for teaching. And I believe that RMF, or the Roads Must Fall, as well as the Fees Must Fall movement, changed the South African landscape, and especially the media landscape. The establishment of something like the Economic Freedom Fighters was also a defining moment in South African politics, and subjects that were previously taboo suddenly became everyday topics, and everyone was talking about white supremacy, white privilege, racism, sexism, classism, inclusive education, the land question, decolonizing education, etc., etc. And these are all concepts and theories that existed in sociology and political philosophy, but they needed to be translated into journalism teaching. Or at least I felt that, because I was teaching political reporting in particular. So my whole idea was that I am preparing children for this world, because this is the reality and this is the current world. And it would be amiss for me to come in and lecture political reporting as other people before me had come in and lectured it, because they would have been operating in a completely different context. So what is the purpose of journalism education? Journalism education is about improving the quality of journalism by improving the quality of journalists. It is perceived to be the one way in which society can intervene to influence the development of journalism. In other words, the kind of education future journalists receive matters because journalists matter among the many factors that make up journalism. So it was important for me to lay the foundation for the attitudes and knowledge of these future journalists. UNESCO says journalism and the educational programs that enable individuals to practice and upgrade their journalistic skills are essential tools for the underpinning of key democratic principles that are fundamental to the development of every country. So I had to be aware that not only am I teaching journalism and political reporting, but if I do this job right, I am in a way going to contribute to the establishment of key democratic principles, which are very fundamental to the development of our democracy. So my purpose as a lecturer and as a teacher became even bigger than just imparting knowledge about political reporting. So I had to then look at the aim versus the reality. So there's a very specific aim, obviously, as I've said, of journalism education, and then there's the reality. The reality is that journalists come from a variety of educational backgrounds. The reality is that only a minority of journalists will have completed degrees in journalism, media, or communication studies before becoming journalists. The reality is that an increase in higher education offerings in media, communications, or journalism study doesn't always translate into journalists actively taking them as pathways to their job. So we find that in journalism, at least more of our students end up in communications departments rather than as journalists. So for me, that's something that's important for me to be aware of as and when I'm teaching, because I need to be teaching political reporting as you would report as a reporter, but I need to be aware that at the back of my head that these people are likely to be doing political communication rather than political reporting. So there's a whole debate within the journalism space where there are those who argue for journalism as a trade and those who argue for journalism as a profession. So is it a trade or is it a profession? That depends on who you're speaking to. Some say journalism training perpetuates or modifies professional practices and molds the perceptions of journalists, the perceptions that journalists have of the role and the function of the media. Professionalization, which is seen as underpinning the tertiary journalism education. It's also seen as enriching the quality of information produced, and with the help of this, quality journalism hopefully will emerge, and there'll be an achievement of improvement in the workings of civil society. So again, it's bigger than just teaching journalists to be journalists. It's about being aware that you're contributing to creating a democratic space where all voices are heard. What is the history of journalism education? The idea of achieving a better journalism by giving journalists a college or university education was born in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. And it's only in the 1980s and 1990s that journalism became accepted as a subject field worldwide. The US not only pioneered journalism education, but also pioneered news journalism in particular. This means that journalism is an Anglo-American invention, and we are aware that this comes with its own baggage. So the early courses that were done included technical printing skills as well as writing and editing rather than focusing on reporting. And Joseph Pulitzer gave money to Columbia University to establish a school of journalism, which was then opened in 1912. Pulitzer's motive was to improve the minds of journalists at a time when many, if not most, reporters came from working class families. He wanted to achieve this by providing them with the liberal arts education that he felt they lacked. And I think it's important to keep this particular sentence at the back of the mind. He wanted to improve the minds of journalists at a time when many, if not most, of these reporters came from working class families. And that is the reality that we find ourselves as CPUT. A lot of our students come from working class families. And how do we think about that? Do we receive that and do we acknowledge that in the way that we teach? So again, there was another approach, obviously, which was by Blair in the 1920s, and he placed this new study, so that's journalism, within Wisconsin University's PhD programs in political science and sociology. And this decision to locate journalism in the social sciences had long-term implications. The founders of many major journalism schools elsewhere came from this Wisconsin program and carried its empirical social sciences assumptions with them. And I believe that my thinking probably falls more within Blair's kind of thinking, because I believe that journalism is very much linked to sociology, is very much linked to political science. Because you cannot teach journalists in a sort of vacuum without taking into context the political situation that they're operating in. Another approach was Wilbur Schramm. He initially chose to place this new communication program within the existing discipline of journalism, but communication as a field of study then overtook its host and left behind journalism education, which could not shed its tag of vocational training. Unlike Pulitzer, Professor Blair, Williams, and Schramm were interested only in journalism and not journalists. This left journalism education in an easy spot between practical and academic studies, and this is where I believe it still finds itself. The discussion about the professionalization of journalism and the journalism education curriculum highlights the unresolved nature of the debate. So I teach, and I come from from the critical theorist school of thought. And obviously, as part of this, you also have which one could argue is also the predecessor of critical theory, which is dependency theorists. And this is the notion that resources flow from a periphery of poor, underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former. So dependency theory technically has nothing to do with journalism, but you'll see how it links. Many dependency theories have criticized social and cultural imperialism. They criticize African and other developing countries for taking the Western or American model of journalism and trying to implement it in an African or developing world context. Despite the strong criticism, journalism education programs in Africa are still largely patterned directly on those in Europe and the United States. So what I'm saying is a lot of our journalism programs throughout the country and throughout the continent are based on the history that I've given you, where they basically, we cut and paste stuff from the US and from the UK without necessarily thinking about what context are we operating in and how is it different from the UK and the US system, and how do we make sure that we bring it back to the context that we are in and the reality that we're in. So some of journalism's programs could be moved, I'm arguing that as they are, some of them could literally be taken to the United States without changing texts, curriculums, or instructors. And for me, that's a problem because you essentially are teaching children in South Africa without giving them a South African context, even though ultimately you want to put them in a South African context and in a South African newsroom. So you're not preparing these people for the world that they are going into. You're preparing them for, I don't know actually what we're preparing them for. So African journalism training needs to be relevant to Africa's social and cultural situation. But this is the new realization. And I believe that this, to a certain extent, is a situation I arrived and found at CPUT journalism, which was, it was mainly a department that had some local content but could easily be transplanted and taught at an American or UK university. So, as I've said earlier, there's a lot of critique by dependency theorists, and some of this critique stems from the fact that to be scholarly in the Western academic tradition is to be scientific, and therefore detached from the social causes of the day. A real question then for me is, can Africa afford this type of education to be the basis of its university programs, especially those which are supposed to contribute to the solution of current social problems? It is just this scientific detachment that has brought some of the most scathing criticism in the field of communication and journalism from dependency theories. So one of the dependency theorists was Beltran, and he carries the argument to its logical conclusion or logical extreme. And he says that the very research methods employed are strongly influenced and even dictated by the social setting of those who select them. And he says these methods concentrate on the receiver and ignore deeper information structures. And this is because American researchers in mass communications do not question their own social structures. They therefore use research methods that take the individual out of the social context. So I'm saying this is what we've been doing. And it's problematic because you are basically taking a person out of their social context and you expect them to thrive and you expect them to learn, even though you're not giving them anything that's familiar to them and you're not explaining the actual current world that they live in. So for me, the important thing in terms of how I developed my curriculum was about bringing back social context. And I believe that decolonizing curriculum, decolonizing even journalism studies, becomes about bringing back the social context. Some of the questions that I had to ask in developing a decolonized curricula was, what is the new social context in a post-Rhodes Must Fall, in a post-Fees Must Fall South Africa? How do we deal with this? How do we study it? And how do we report on things like inequality? How do we deal with and study structural discrimination or structural, so that's structural racism, sexism, etc., etc. And it was very important for me that our students understood that apartheid divisions still play an important role and have an effect on where people live, work, and play in South Africa. And apartheid categories still determine who has access to what resources, when, and how. And apartheid categories still determine people's worldviews, and this is of themselves as well as of others. So some of the questions that I grappled with in putting this together was, how do we break these apartheid divisions? How do we equalize the playing field in terms of the base and understanding of social structures by all students? How do we develop students who are aware of the social context and its impact on their work as journalists? And how do we develop socially aware students of journalism? Because for me, it was about students are learning journalism in order to go out and report back to the world and to South Africa and to communities who we are, how we think, how we live, etc., etc. And if they're not socially aware of themselves, but also of the environment that they're operating in, then you're going to have a disjuncture where people are reading newspapers and they're like, what is this Cape Town that you are telling me about? I don't live in this Cape Town. I've never been to this Cape Town. And it happens a lot. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are like, I read the media and I feel like they're not talking to me. They're not talking about me. They're not reflecting me. So for me, it was important that my students understood and were able to be taught in such a way that when they leave, they don't reproduce that problematic, lacking in social context reportage. So the answer then became developing a curriculum based on critical theory, as I said. Critical theory, as you know, is a philosophical approach to culture and especially to literature that seeks to confront the social, historical, and ideological forces and structures that produce and constrain it. Critical theory has two meanings with two different origins and histories. The first originated in sociology and political philosophy, while the second originated in literary studies and literal theory. So obviously I'm focused more on the one that originated in sociology and political philosophy. So then the question becomes, which curriculum? While no one doubts the necessity of imparting skills, and these are defined as interviewing, reporting, researching, sourcing, writing, editing, and this is in journalism, the relevance of the inquiry into the nature and rituals of journalism has been questioned, and in particular, it has been questioned by future employers. So Skinner, Gashner, and Compton argue for an integrated curriculum. So this is part of that conversation of whether we are a trade or a profession, are we vocational training, are we academic, where are we exactly? And these guys say that journalism as a practice has to be a practice of meaning production, in which it is fundamental that students understand the signifying power of language and that they grasp that journalism is not simply a transparent stenography of the real. Journalists become more than uncritical reporters. And this is something that I emphasize to my students all the time. There's a field of journalism that says journalists are neutral and they just record. I think that's bull, to be honest with you. Because I believe that we come with our own baggage to whatever situation we come with. And we need to be aware of that background, and we need to make sure that we critically analyze our own reportage and how it's based on the baggage that we carry. So if I'm poor and I am writing about a rich person's story, my poverty is going to show through in that reportage. And rather than pretending like it doesn't, which is what I think the neutral journalism as neutral agents theorists believe, I believe that you should acknowledge it and you should find a way to actually say, this is who I am and this is how this affected my reportage on this particular issue. Because then you are reflecting and the audience knows sort of all your, they've got more transparency on where you're coming from and why you think the way that you think. So a new teaching method emerged. And this teaching method for me took into account the criticisms by dependency theorists as well as the importance of social context and understanding the South African story. All curricula that was developed in a way that forced students to constantly ask and answer. How does race, class, gender, etc. impact one's ability to access government resources, ability to write about rich, poor, black, white, men, women, etc.? To me, this became important when teaching a specialist reporting subject like political reporting for first years and second year students. So then I had to obviously do a lot of unpacking with the students. In teaching about apartheid inequality, for instance, and the different experiences of oppression and discrimination experienced by Indians versus coloreds versus Africans, who now obviously fall under the political black term, it became clear that the class did not have the same base knowledge. Parents, after some conversations with students, started sending emails to the program coordinator at the back there And some parents even made personal visits to him, calling me divisive, racist, and not fit to teach. What was I teaching that was so racist? I was teaching this. So this is an example of one of the facts and figures that I was teaching. I spoke to education spending by the apartheid government, which illustrates the unequal treatment of South Africans received based on one's race. So I think this one is from 1982, where the money spent was, the average for whites was 74.30, for Indian children it was 26.83, for colored children it was 17.71, for Africans it was 2.39. No, I think it's in the 60s, sorry, I didn't put that, yeah, it was 2.39. So you can just see that when we were talking education, there was oppression of the Indian, oppression of the colored, oppression of the African, but the levels of oppression were different. And this is how we come to a South Africa that has different understandings of inequality and oppression, and that has different reaction to oppression and inequality. And for me, it was very important that my students understood that, because they were going to go out there and interview Black, Indian, colored, all kinds of South Africans, and they needed to understand, where do our sources of rage and our sources of oppression, our sources of everything that went on, where do they come from, and why are they so different, and why are they so differentiated, you know? So as I say, in other words, the per capita state expenditure on school education for Africans was just over 3.2% of the per capita expenditure on school education for white children. There was also free and compulsory education for only white children, and many children of color did not go to school or only did so briefly. So this is just like one of the things that I taught, which like led to, you know, me being a racist. Upon further investigation and conversations with the class, it became clear that students actually didn't understand the sociological meaning of privilege, and were therefore shocked when I said colored and Indian people have had some privilege during apartheid. This was a function of our education system not teaching our history properly, as well as parents not giving children a basic understanding of South African politics. And I believe that there was an active attempt by parents and therefore students to erase apartheid and interrogating its effects on students and race discussions today. So I'm in this situation. I've got Jude sweating there at the back in his office because he's got these parents, and I'm like, these parents are angry, the students in my class are angry, what do we do? So I go over to my friend here, Daniela, and we talk about it. And they're like, we need to do something that is going to basically illustrate to the students everything I've been trying to teach them in a way that doesn't make them have their back up. So in a way that doesn't make them feel like I am white and I am responsible for the colonization of Black people, or I am colored and I benefited from apartheid, or whatever people were thinking that was making them have these very emotional reactions to what I was saying. So we decided, actually, we're going to do a privilege walk workshop. And we convened it on the first and the second years. And so we did the privilege walk. The privilege walk is basically you ask a number of questions, and ultimately, if you do it right and if you ask the right questions, intersectionality will be very visible to everyone. And exactly as we had expected, intersectionality theory was actualized and visualized by making students doing this privilege walk. This was an important exercise for helping students get a deeper understanding of the social structures that underpin their positions in society. The privilege walk activity also helps students to learn to recognize how power and privilege can affect our lives even when we are not aware it is happening. The purpose is not to blame anyone for having more power or privilege or for receiving more help in achieving goals, but to have an opportunity to identify both obstacles and benefits experienced in our life. So we did this walk, and it was amazing and it was powerful. And the reaction that we got from students was it was very good. And then we walked away and we were like, that was nice, it was very good. But there was a certain level of discomfort. what possibly was wrong. And we realized, no, in the process of trying to get students to understand their privilege, we were actually re-oppressing and re-traumatizing the students who were underprivileged. Because we were firmly saying, this is your place in society, and leaving them there. So then we decided we needed to change this. And we then convened, as I've said, identified that it's reinforcing of stereotypes, i.e. the white male ended up the first in line because the lens that we use to examine privilege uses questions that privilege the white male. We have now undertaken the process of developing a South African and CPUT-centric privilege walk that asks the usual questions, so the usual privilege walk questions, but also plan to have a second privilege walk activity that also identifies the strengths of people of different races, class, and gender. And we believe that this will help students to identify where they were privileged according to society, but also understand how some things perceived as disadvantage can be advantageous in a multicultural society. So, for instance, some of the questions that we actually did it at Stellenbosch not too long ago when I was asked to chair a session about critical tools for engagement, and it worked out quite beautifully. So what we did is we asked the students to just tell us, having seen what they've seen, what do we need to do to bring, because obviously you get black women at the back and the white men at the front. So we say, how do we create a more just society? How do we create a more equal society that doesn't discriminate? Because if we continue the way we are continuing, we're actually just pressing pause and leaving apartheid as it was, whilst having removed the laws. So how do we change this? So then we ask students to give us questions that tell us, in this new society and in this new South Africa, what do we want to see? What do we want to value? And it was amazing the kind of questions that students came up with. So they came up with questions like, who speaks more languages than English and Afrikaans? Because that then affirms people whose languages are never actually spoken of as advantages or skills that people have. Because we always talk about, even in our entrance exams and in our application forms, knowledge of good English is a must. Without thinking about the fact that 80% of the South African population, English is actually like second, sometimes even third language. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll take questions, discussions. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts. And then, yeah, the last thing. So one of my inspirations is the ever unputdownable, unstoppable Angela Davis, who was a member of the Black Panther in the US. And I love this quote because I feel like it epitomizes me and what I'm always trying to do. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And I wish that as educators, we would all adopt that. Because we have the opportunity to create a new future through our students, literally in every single class that we teach. And I believe that this is something that can be transferred irrespective of the subject that you teach. So maybe you're thinking, I'm in architecture. How do I decolonize curriculum in architecture? Of course you can, because you can do that by recognizing that a shack is actually a structure that people recognize as a home. And when you talk about architecture, you acknowledge a shack as a structure that people call a home, instead of looking at it as this is the ideal and this is the problem.